think we will begin with the next session. Kindly request everyone to take your seats. Our next session is a roundtable on page and port, Indo-Portuguese myth or literature. The chair of the session is the Jnanpith awardee, Damodar Mauzo, who is a recipient of, he's a short fiction writer and a novelist writing in Konkani. He's the recipient of the Jnanpith Award in 2022. He has won many other awards, including the Sahitya Academy Award in 1983. He is also a columnist, translator, critic, and scriptwriter. He is the most translated author of Konkani. His collection of stories, such as Teresa's Man and Other Stories, was nominated for the prestigious Frank O'Connor International Prize. His books have been finalists for many national awards, including the Crossword Prize 2024. So far, he has about 30 fiction books besides his edited and translated works. He also has a book, Ink of Dissent, a collection of essays originally written in English. Welcome, sir. Let's give him a round of applause. So with the permission of the chair, I will invite the panelists. Reverend Dr. Father Eufemian Miranda. He has a formation in the classics from the seminaries of Saligao and Rashol. After obtaining his MA, he taught Portuguese and English at St. Xavier's College, Mapsa. He did his PhD at Goa University on the topic 19th to 20th century Indo-Portuguese literature, a study of major themes in the socio-historical background, which was published under the auspices of the Department of Art and Culture, Government of Goa, bearing the title Oriente e Ocidente na Literatura Goesa, East and West in Goan Literature. Welcome. Our next panelist is Ms. Sheila Jayawant. She was born and educated in Bombay and currently lives in Sangolda, Goa. She has been writing regularly since 1983. She wrote a weekly humor column for nearly 20 years for 2 local papers and continues to write for Goa Today. She has translated books from Marathi to English. Her most recent book, the first book of Indian English poems, was published in 2022. She has been a prize winner on the jury and editor of the Fundação Orient short story competitions at various times. Welcome, ma'am. Our next panelist, Mr. Madhav Borkar, who has done his MA in English and Aesthetics. He writes in Konkani, Marathi, and English. He has 9 collections of poems to his credit. He received the Sahitya Academy Prize in 2001 for his collection of poems titled Yaman. Besides this, he has also translated poems of Rabindranath Tagore into Konkani. Borkar joined All India Radio in 1984 and retired as Indian Broadcasting Service officer in 2014. A warm welcome to you, Mr. Borkar. Next, we have Dr. Anil Kumar Yadav, who is a scholar and translator specializing in Indo-Portuguese language and literature. His PhD, founded by Camões IP, was completed under the supervision of Professora Maria Luisa Malatre and Professor Delfim Correa da Silva, Director of Camões IP Goa. His research, the philosophical elements of the Buddhist and Vedic tradition in the work of Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa, was successfully defended and awarded in 2023. Dr. Anil has translated notable works including Zé Luís Peixoto's Murreste-me and Retratos Luso-Asiáticos da Índia into Hindi. Welcome, Doctor.
सगळ्या गोंयकार भावां भयणांक म्हजो माये मोगाचो नमस्कार. And all those who do not belong to Goa, a very warm welcome to this session. Well, I was here in the morning. I regret that I could not attend yesterday's day, but I probably would have added to my knowledge, but unfortunately I could not attend yesterday. But this morning I was here and I have seen and I noticed how difficult it is to chair a session, because to keep the time of the session, it is a really very difficult task. But then I hope my co-panelists here will help me to sail so safely and smoothly. We have very little time at our disposal. I'm told that we can cut into the lunch time, but I don't want to make it difficult for you. I hope we manage it in the given time. The topic given to us is India, Goa and Portugal, you can say, myth and, the myth and literature. So we are going to discuss literature and also the myths surrounding the language, the Goa culture and all that. So without wasting much of your time, our time rather, I will request, yes, I would like to request, to my right here is Reverend Father Miranda, Ifemiano Miranda, whom I know for last several years, several decades rather. Very dedicated writer. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the things, but a very dedicated writer. I visited his house and I was just telling my friends, it is a perfect ambience I find there. He lives, his house is on all sides, it is surrounded by greenery, big trees and small trees, and he sits in the balcony writing alone. That is perfect way of how a writer has to be and how the ambience has to be. I was rather fortunate to be present. Rather, his book was launched at my hands, I believe, long time back. But that book I remember, Oriente e Ocidente na Literatura Goesa. So I would love to invite him to start the discussions. Father, please.
Friends, I would like to express right at the beginning my great joy and honor to be here, have been invited by the University of Goa to be part of this colloquium or symposium on India and Portugal, a confluence of cultures. I thank and I appreciate, thank you very much to all the organizers. I would like to express also my great joy and honor to be part of this panel of which Mr. Damodar Mauzo is the chair. There is a friendship of old, as is expressed, between the two of us. I appreciate him, the person, and the writer that he is. And as he said at the beginning, it was at his hands, and the former consul of Portugal in Goa, I don't get the name, sorry, that my book was launched. Thank you, I would like to acknowledge here publicly. I will be very brief in my presentation. My presentation is simply this. The title of my presentation is Goan Literature of Portuguese Expression, an imponderable of the Goanness or Goenkarpon with a question mark. What has been commonly known as Indo-Portuguese literature is better expressed or defined today as Goan literature of Portuguese expression. It is Goan because in its substratum it pertains to or it concerns Goa. Indeed, it was produced by ethnically Indian persons of Goa who, within their narrative power and in the center of their emotions, expressed or dealt with creatively with themes concerning the society, history, heritage of Goa. It's obvious I am dealing here with creative literature, or what is commonly called fiction, or fruit of creative imagination. I'm not referring to historiography, to sociology, least even to scientific writing in Portuguese, in which so many Goans excelled in elegant Portuguese language. The corpus of this Goan creative literature is not vast. However, whatever was written contains some jewels of creative literature. Literature is an art which, like any other art, whether it is music, sculpture, painting, craftsmanship, whatever, is fruit of the human creative impulse. True art is timeless, we know it very well. We say also it stands the test of time, whatever be the medium by which it is expressed. What does it mean? In simple terms, is a work of art stands always, has a life of its own. The essence of it lasts long after its creator is dead or forgotten. And in that vital aspect, the spirit of its creator lives on to reach out anyone who at any point of time will come into contact with it. In the context of our symposium, we could ask, what is the relevance of the Goan literature of Portuguese expression to Goa and to India-Portugal relationship? Is this a mere academic exercise in an ivory tower of an university? Or does it have some practical purpose, some utility, like trade relations, job opportunities? Yesterday, the Vice Chancellor was referring to that. Does it have anything? I would not like to answer everything, but at the beginning, at the outset, I would like to say, when we try to answer this question, what is the purpose, what is the relevance, I would like to, or it would be worth remembering on the part of all of us, that in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher and theologian, commenting on Aristotle, gave this lapidary phrase in Latin: genus humanum arte et ratione vivit. The essential meaning of it being human beings live a really human life thanks to culture. The late Pope John Paul II, in an address to the UNESCO, quoted beautiful sentence, this phrase of Thomas Aquinas. This is a value-charged principle, very much consonant with our ancient Indian philosophy. Any one of us who may at times be tempted to live by a mere utilitarian philosophy. So it's a remedy for all of us. For us in Goa, it is an urgent task to live by a culture of what we are, of our identity, of our Goanness, of our Goenkarpon, as we call it, which I dare to say is our consciousness of the elements, rather, consciousness of the ingredients of our cultural evolution is starting already from the petroglyphs at Pansimal and Uzgalimal. The name Aparanta, given eventually by Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka, transformed, touched by Buddhism, the land beyond the limits. He told his missionaries when he sent them in the 2nd century before Christ. The mellifluous Konkani language that was born here and was developed to be such a finest sounding language. Sounds of the Shigmo Dol, as we call it, or the Kunbi rhythms, the colors of the canvases of Francis Newton de Souza or Lakshman Pai, Navalkar, the red stone and the white lime of the churches and temples of Goa, the music of the late Lata Mangeshkar and Lorna Chris Perry, and so many other traces and features which would be difficult, if not impossible, to enumerate and to identify. Goanness is the symphony of the collective memory of all these ingredients that I try to put in a few words. Now, Goan literature of Portuguese expression is, in my opinion, one of those strands of this heritage. The beauty of it cannot be seen with the eyes. It cannot be touched by the hands. It can only be seen and experienced only with the eyes and the hands of the heart, as Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said in the Petit Prince. For an orchestra, I put again the comparison. It's a symphony, I said, no? For an orchestra to perform perfectly, the orchestra needs to be perfectly tuned, and the poets did it for us. Poets are these fine tuners. When an artist of the pen of the stature of Bakibab Borkar wrote, "Na minha terra de Goa, erguem-se as cruzes e as cúpulas, e são outros tajes banhados de luar e de lágrimas de fé." Bakibab coined the beautiful word in Portuguese, taji, plural tajes, obviously from the Mumtaz Mahal, which is to draw a canvas of the socio-architectural Goan landscape in which one breathes harmony, serenity, and delight. When a Sarasvat Brahmin like Lakshman Rao Sardesai, in two of his best-known compositions, So Teu Filho and Gauro, he affirms his faith in being a Gauro. Sim, mãe, sou Gauro, sou teu filho. Yes, mother, I am Gauro, I am your son. He identifies himself with pride, with the features and ancestrality of Tellus Mater, the Mother Earth. Teresa de Souza, another poet from Bardej, now I don't know whether she lives, raised those women whom we consider prosaically as hands for manual work of the ST class. She raised them to the level of charming and graceful Dravidian Venus, and has got a poem. I'm not going to quote it because I would be long. Venus Dravidas, at par with the Venus, it reminds you Venus of Milos, or Aphrodite or Athena of Praxiteles in ancient Greece. The poetry of Mariano Gracias, Paulino Dias, Nascimento Mendonça, to quote a few, gives us this, we find that in their works, a sonnet like Vyasa, making us feel that we are in front of a Moses or David of Michelangelo. And we know that Michelangelo, after producing that statue of Moses, he said, "Parla," and he hit with his instrument on him. "Parla," speak. It was so good. The Vyasa is as beautiful. Nascimento Mendonça gives us the poem Salome, considered as the highest Indo-Portuguese poetic achievement, which could be perfectly made into a ballet piece like Oscar Wilde's Salome, set to music by Richard Strauss. The poets did the finer tune of that symphony orchestra, which is our culture. Orlando Costa's O Signo da Ira, a literary prize-winning novel, could be made perfectly into a film of social realism, very much or parallel to Par of Gautam Ghosh, which was awarded the top honors in the Venice Festival in 1978. All this is to quote just a few samples of the beauty of the Goan writing in Portuguese. As a Portuguese literary critic said, our literature, this Goan literature, is of Portuguese expression and Indian in its core, it is, in the aesthetics, in its themes, and in the motives which are, in which the whole literature is woven. Simultaneously, we, lovers of Goa, lovers of art, would do well to recall that in the 15th and 16th century, the European Gothic architecture was enriched in Portugal with motifs that speak of the Portuguese maritime adventure, flora, fauna, ropes, anchors, the cross of the Order of Christ, and other motifs, which made the ornate Gothic into the Manueline style, a characteristic Portuguese Gothic style. In a similar way, the Goan literature of Portuguese expression has a right place in the Portuguese literary tradition. In the world of art, there can be no gaps or distances. The Portuguese showed it. The artists are living witnesses to it. And Fernando Pessoa, the iconic poet of the 20th century, expressed it when she said, "E outra vez, conquistemos a distância do mar ou outra, mas que seja nossa." And once again, let us conquer the distance of the sea or any other, provided that it is ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. You kept up the word, you finished in time, and you have stuck to you have presented your theme very well. You spoke of the writings, elegance of writing in Portuguese, particularly by Goan writers, how literature touches upon touches the intangible, or how it sees the invisible. You have shown how our writers kept up to that quality. I don't know whether you did not touch upon Francis Lewis.
Yes, I would like that. There is also the Burki of Agustin Fernandes.
Yes, yes. Yeah, probably the lack of time, but whenever we think of Goan writing in Portuguese, how can we forget Francis Lewis Gomes, who has given us the first ever, probably the novel by any Indian into Portuguese or any European language, I believe. I'm not sure, I'm not studious about it. But then, you have given done justice to the topic. Thank you for that. And now we move on to. Okay. We have with us Ms. Sheila Chaiwant, who will present her thoughts in a different way, not the conventional way, I believe, because I know her as a writer. She has been writing for Navin Times and other dailies in Goa, and her humorous column was very much appreciated, including by me. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So, I just want the last 2 slides, or the last 3 slides. Can you go down? Yes. It's not done. It's not done. So, yeah, the last 2. Yeah, this one. This is it. That's it. Good afternoon, everyone. The word confluence, everybody feels that there is something very gentle and smooth about it. But very often when there is confluence, there is friction and there is turbulence, which is what happened in my family. In 1944, when the World War II was still going on, 13 years before I was born, my uncle, who was a surgeon, was sent to Portugal for higher studies. And there he did a very bad thing. He fell in love with a Portuguese woman. She was a music teacher. When they told her parents, that reaction was always as we would understand it. But when he wrote a letter to his father, my Azo, in Palolem, Kankon, Palolem was really backward, really jungly, so to say, in those days. But there the reaction was, some people had guar and some people had chati dhar and whatever. But it was not to be understood. How can one of our boys fall in love with a pakli? Unheard of. So the first letter that went from my grandfather was no. Immediately my grandfather was a softie, I believe. So when the second letter went, he said, okay, fine, but get her here. Third letter went, absolutely not. Fourth letter went, it's okay, we understand. Fifth letter went, you're defiling the religion, you're spoiling our family, all of that. So why this oscillation and this alternating of yes and no was because we had an uncle who, my mother's uncle, who actually told the family that we should carry out a shraddh, consider him dead, have nothing to do with him because he has dared to defy us and get married to a pakli. Out of the question. Till that point, they were not married. But this back and forth went on, and each letter, I think, took about 3 weeks or 4 weeks to reach Portugal, Palolem. Finally, in 1948, they did get married, and they came here in the month of July or August when the monsoons were heavy. Now, you just think of this nice Portuguese girl in her little frock, comes to Palolem. In Lisbon, her house probably had a garden with pretty flowers and curtains, crockery and cutlery, tiled floor, toilet with flush, all of that. So here she comes to Kankon, where cow dung floor, hardly any windows. The kitchen had wooden chulas. Men were dressed so inappropriately, they wore nothing on the top. They were showing off their hairy chests. So she was disgusted and probably repulsed by all of this. But she was, when she came to the threshold, she was welcomed with haldi kukum, ovalni, the works. And for that, the full credit I give to my great-grandmother. She told the rest of the family, if this girl can leave her people, her parents, for the sake of our son, we will treat her like the eldest daughter-in-law of this family should be, with full respect and honor. And they didn't know the language. They didn't know what to feed her because she didn't understand spices and coconut milk and strange fish and even stranger vegetables. So in the kindness of their hearts, remember, we didn't have the parda system, but our genders were still segregated. The men could speak Portuguese, but she was not allowed there. The women couldn't understand a word she spoke, and she was forced to sit with them. And them, without blouses, mostly, they were wearing 9 yards, so they were showing their legs till their thigh. It was quite a horrible experience for her, and she was homesick. So what they did was they created a little space for her in the kitchen where she was allowed to cook her food. Because she was a nice person, she did not cook beef or pork, but she did use vinegar, and she did put salt in her rice, and she made stuff like stew and white sauce, which was not appreciated by everybody else, but she understood that they were being kind in their own way. And the generation before my mother's, they kind of appreciated that she had taken this step to become one of them. He was outcast. No grocer would sell ration to my grandfather, so he had to go at least to Saudi, if not to Margao, to be able to buy rations for his family. When they had a puja for Panchami, no Savashni would come to their house. I'm sorry, some of you may not understand these words. Afterwards, you may ask me these questions. But when my aunt was invited to, say, a haldi kukum, she was defiant. She must have been a tomboy, because she wouldn't have come so far if she didn't have that element of adventure in her. So when she was invited for a haldi kukum, she would go and she would target the most conservative looking woman. She would touch her and say, "Ata tu bhashtile, ata sunna." So these were the things that offended the family, but they took it in their stride. Of course, there were fights in the house. And how bitter the fights were, let me tell you. My uncle did not hold on to a proper job. He was highly qualified, but he was not earning a living because he got into politics and he thought that he should chase the Portuguese away. And here was his wife, who was considered traitor by both sides. The Portuguese thought she's the enemy. She's married somebody from Goa, and of course the Hindu family simply did not like what she had done. So when they were staying in Mapsa, they told her, "You are at the topmost of the sibling category. You have to look after the youngest two siblings." Now she didn't have furniture, she didn't have proper vessels, but she bought herself a piano. And here, though I believe she was not a feminist because she was led by the choices that her husband made, but she decided, I will earn a living, I will teach music to the good Catholic children around and make them appear for the Trinity College exam, which shows her independence. This is the European thought process that we have inherited 2 generations later. So in Mapsa, where she was living, and my 2 aunts were sent to her, she chopped off their hair. Oh my God, you cut a hair of a good Hindu girl who's unmarried? Okay, so my grandfather went there and told her, "Bad girl, not to do this again." So she said, okay, and she did something worse. On New Year's Eve, she took these 2 girls for a dance, for a ball, and they danced with strange men. Shame to the family, to the religion, to the country, shame. So this was the background that this was the friction, this is the turbulence out of which confluence actually happens. So my aunts went in for higher education, they chose their husbands. After they got married, they cut off their hair and danced with whomsoever they wanted. The change had already come about. It must have been extremely difficult at that time for my grandparents and my mother's family. It was probably as difficult for her parents in Portugal. Both ways. Fast forward to nearly 60 years down the line, she lived to be 100 years old. My mama died in 91 or 92. At the age of 87, she decided to marry her childhood sweetheart in Portugal. Now, my family at that time thought disloyalty, I mean, what is wrong with her? We understand that she got married to our mama when she was in her 20s. How can she do this to us? Now she's a Mrs. Gaitonde. Remember, for 60 years she's been Mrs. Gaitonde, so now my family thinks she's ours. All right? Very recently, as recently as November this year, I met the niece of her second husband. She had come to Goa, and I mean, for us it was, you know, what is she like? More like that. And she told me that it was shocking in Portugal for somebody so old to remarry, and to marry somebody who was a childhood sweetheart when you've been widowed. So people essentially don't change. Even if your cultures are different, there are some emotions which are universal. Probably literature brings about all that. When I heard this, and when I heard some of the language changes in the morning session, I realized that at some basic level we're all the same. But when we have to have a confluence of culture, there is going to be some rubbing, some quarreling, till it all settles down. Let me see if I have anything else left. Okay, now the Catholics and the Hindus in those days, they lived in different solitudes. The Catholics had no clue what the Hindus did at home, and the Hindus had no clue what the Catholics were up to. Now my aunt had a particular, there's one instance I'm telling you out of several. My aunt had a particular Catholic friend who used to come home frequently, and one day she told my aunt, do you know, these Hindus, they drink cow urine. So she promptly narrated this to my uncle, and my uncle, maverick as he was, one day when these two were sitting together, he barged into the room and he said, Edila, where is my daily glass of Gaumutra? I haven't got it today. So, intermarriage at that time probably had objections from the families, but it was not a communal problem. I'm sorry to say it today, it might be, in today's India. That is about it. I was given 10 minutes. I'm sure I've completed more than that. I have 2 more minutes? Okay. So the influence on us was very, very strong, because we had never seen a, when I say we, I'm also talking about my mother's generation, they had never seen a foreigner in their lives. The men had seen some policemen, white-skinned, in uniform at a distance, but otherwise no one had seen a foreigner face to face. So for them, what they felt, I realized when I was working in a hotel nearby, and there was a small Indian child, and one of our charter reps, who was Finn, she went to do kuchi 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 to that child. Now that child sees this white figure with blonde hair and light eyes, and her reaction was, bhoot. So, right, so it sounds funny now. It sounds very funny now, but it must have been quite shocking for my aunts and my grandfather living in a certain milieu, which is why I have presented these photographs to you. This is what my ancestors looked like, just one generation removed from me. Madhav Dada? Madhav Dada and I share some ancestors, and therefore I'm pointing it out to him. And this is what my aunt and uncle looked like. See the difference in culture. You can just see it even through a slide and through photographs. They were worlds apart. They were planets apart. And yet when she came, and it took a couple of years, no doubt, for her to settle in, because and this I have of course seen, where she would be talking to one of my great aunts in her Portuguese. She learned Konkani. And one day at the International Center here, she had also learned Hindi when she was studying when she was living in Delhi. So one day at the International Center here, you know how these waiters hang around foreigners and kind of avoid people in saris? That happened to us. So he was hanging around her and he asked her, would you like anything more? And she turned to the waiter and she said, is coffee ko jara garam kar sakte ho kya? And he was taken aback because he didn't expect that. She spoke Konkani. She would say that because we didn't speak Portuguese. And she she was our eyes before the internet and everything. She was the one who told us this is what life is like in England or in Portuguese. And in our imaginations, I've not been to Portugal, but in my imagination, that was what the world was like. And that, to me, was the confluence of culture, which in little eddies, she exposed my great aunts and my aunts to a different world. They exposed their children to different worlds. We told our friends about it, and that is how the culture spread. A mixed culture, if I may say so. My 2 minutes are up.
Yes,
Thank you so much for listening to me.
My talk was so interesting. Your talk was so interesting, I forgot to keep the time. Anyway, how well she connected with her personal experience, her marriage of her grand uncle. You know, that marriage was international, interracial, intercontinental, interreligious, and whatnot. And during those years, what a turmoil must have happened in your family.
Sir, I just want to point out one thing. My great-grandmother was illiterate, but illiterate does not mean unintelligent. She was the one who welcomed this person into our house and changed the world for us.
That shows how education has nothing to do with the knowledge, intelligence. Anyway, yes. How symbolic it is that how cultures are imbibed and how confluence happens when you are open-minded, and that is exactly what has happened to Goa. That is exactly what has happened to our languages and our cultures. This give and take is very, very important. That is what I think we have to take away home. Now, Father Miranda spoke about the Goan literature in Portuguese, and here we have yet another learned panelist, poet Madhav Borkar, who will speak about the Goanness in Portuguese literature, right? Anyway, yeah. So, yes. I hope, so far I have not been able, I don't have to keep the time, and you will stick to it again. Madhav Borkar is a poet, is a voracious reader. That is very, very important. He is a critic and he is a translator. He has translated Tagore into Konkani. So here is Madhav Borkar giving his impressions.
Boa tarde. Let me begin with a rejoinder to what my cousin Sheila Jaivan said. She spoke about her great-grandmother. When she came to know that Sripad was going to marry a Portuguese girl, she said, "No problem, anyhow, he is going to marry a girl." So you can imagine the progressive attitude of her great-grandmother. She had wisdom. She might not have been educated in the academic sense, but she knew the world. She could read human nature. She could read the society. I was quite intimate to Mrs. Idela Gaitonde and Pundalik Gaitonde. We never called him Pundalik. We called him Sripad Bab because he happens to be my father's cousin. I was so happy to see the old photograph of our great-grandmother and my father's two aunts. That's her also, two aunts. So very interesting photograph tell history of the society. I must begin my small talk with an apology. I missed the bus of learning Portuguese. I was in first standard in Marathi and the Portuguese was compulsory and I was taught a primer. I remember just one line. Médico come melão. I haven't forgotten that. I very much regret for not having learnt this language. In fact, I don't know why this language disappeared from this land, and it is a big loss for our society, our intellectual climate. There are so many things we could learn. In fact, we might have hated Salazar, but why hate the language that gave us a lot? That, in fact, so many revolutionaries came from reading Portuguese literature. From Portuguese they learned, they came in contact with so many world thinkers. It's a big loss. I very deeply feel. I'm afraid some may brand me as anti-national. I'm not afraid of that. Now coming to the point, I have to depend on secondary sources. Recently, I feel it all the more because of Fernando Pessoa, a poet whom I consider one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, who has crossed the barriers of the language. We have a small group who read Fernando Pessoa. There are two authors in Marathi. One of them has translated Pessoa's poems into Marathi and published a collection also. I imagine why, suppose I had learned Portuguese, I could have read him in the original. There's another friend of mine who is basically a scientist, he's a mathematical physicist. He was teaching in the University of New Mexico, a student of Lyceum. He had done premier cyclum. So he knows very good Portuguese. His name is Dr. Nitant Kakro. And very often we exchange notes on Fernando Pessoa because he has entire collection of Fernando Pessoa in original Portuguese. Coming back to the topic, one can easily draw a parallel between Toru Dutt and Pauline Dias. Arguably one of the earliest English poet in English, Toru Dutt shares commonalities with Pauline Dias in the sense that she wrote poems based on her reading of Puranas, especially Vishnu Puran, the very long poem she wrote and supposed to be a landmark in the history of Indian poetry in English. The same way you find Pauline Dias also writing about or drawing heavily on Indian mythology. you find him describing Himalayas and so many other Indian myths. So that is one of the important aspects of Pauline Dias. Pauline Dias also wrote something about, I think Ramayana was also one of his most favorite book. He drew heavily on all these two epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Instead of keeping Portuguese poets for his model, he didn't do that. We must make a special mention of another poet called Julio Francis Ataíde Barret, Adiodat Barret, who spent most of his life in Portugal. He lived a very short life, maybe 30 to 34. And he was, in a way, a bilingual poet. He also wrote some poems in Konkani. He was a nationalist in his attitude and always fought against Salazar, for which he had to pay very heavy price. So these are some of the important poets who contributed a lot to the making of Portuguese poetry in Goan poetry in Portuguese. My job has been made very simple because already Dr. Miranda and also my colleague, my friend, Mr. Oscar de Noronha has spoken a lot on this aspect. Very important aspect of this Portuguese language is the entrance of Hindu writers writing in English, in Portuguese. They were very late comers in this area. The reasons are many. Maybe because they started learning Portuguese very late. Maybe because of the religious inhibitions. They thought that if you learn Portuguese, we may lose our religion. We're very sensitive to this particular aspect. So most of them didn't study Portuguese, although the Portuguese language was taught everywhere in Goa. I must make a mention of two thinkers of those time. One of them was Dr. Dada Vaidya, who insisted that we Hindus should learn Portuguese because it is easily available. Access is very good. And second one was another doctor, Fonu Shastri Karinde from Marseille. He said, you must learn Portuguese, at least for the sake of demand. Because we Goans are very fond of demand. So some people used to say with pride, I'm a demandist, that is, it was some kind of a qualification in those days. So you find that their next generation started learning Portuguese and did exceptionally well, excelled. They started going to the Liceu and learning Portuguese, French, German, and that's why we all go, most of the Goans of those generations were polyglots. Because the Liceu provided, wide scope for learning different languages, foreign languages. And another thing, that from Portuguese, they came in contact with European thought, European literature. Say, for instance, Balzac. Then you have Guy de Maupassant, French writers, or H.D. Carroll was the most favorite one with most of these writers, Goan writers. And some of the Hindus cultivated Portuguese language, making some of the passages by heart. They used to copy, passage after passages, just to master that language. So we have Lakshmanrao Sardesai. You have another Sardesai, Anantrao Sardesai. Unfortunately, Anantrao Sardesai's writings is lost. Very difficult to reclaim whatever he had written. You can see some of his writing published in that anthology edited by Vimla Devi. Only there. Then you have Mukund Kedekar. He knew Portuguese very well, also English, Latin. Can you imagine a person knowing so many languages so well? French, of course. And he translated so many Konkani poems into Portuguese, and that's how they enriched Goan Portuguese literature. There are many things to be said, so I better wind up with saying muito obrigado.
Thank you, Mother. Thank you, sir. Now, we have missed us a translator who has translated Portuguese literature into Hindi. A rare words. I don't think any more words have been translated into Hindi from Portuguese by one single translator. I request Dr. Anil Kumari Yadav, who has translated Jose Luis Peixoto into Hindi, and now his next project is to translate Kalidasa, his Abhinyan Shakuntal, into Portuguese.
Boa tarde, good afternoon, namaskar. First and foremost, I would like to pay my gratitude to the organizers who has invited me to be part and parcel of this distinguished panel and able me to physically visible to these audiences. So thank you so much. I would like to speak today about Indo-Portuguese literature and the challenges faced by translator while we translate. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "Let all cultures blow about me, but I refuse to blow off my feet." While speaking on the future of English about 2 years before Goa's liberation, he said, "For what matter, even Portuguese has become an Indian language." After having attained political freedom, no purpose is served in waging a war against Portuguese, English, or any other foreign language, and thus erecting barrier of linguistic chauvinism. Portuguese in Goa has been for centuries the medium of expression for Indian themes. It is no means a strange language. True, it is a foreign language that the colonialists foisted upon Goans, like French in Pondicherry and English in the rest of India. And all along, Goans have been conscious that it is not their language. However, it is in an unquestionable fact that English is more foreign than Portuguese. The mere fact that the vast majority of Indians learnt English, which undoubtedly helped to unite India, does not in any way endow it with more rights than the Portuguese. Once, since centuries, India is a land. does not belong to one. It is a melting pot for various cultures and practices. In the 18th century, the best friend of Goa and the Konkani language was CUNHA RIVARA, who also published weighty research papers on Goan archaeology. Osorio Castro's excavations, Hindu Monuments of Goa, and other important research works are entitled to a place in this survey. However, a name stands out head and shoulders above all is Thomas Ribeiro. A native of Portugal, he came to Goa as a chief secretary after already carving a niche for himself in Portuguese literature with his heroic poem De Jaime. He was quick to recognize that the land of India is a land for letters. Among his notable works are Amidst Palm Trees and others. His best poems, however, are in Old Goa city and the Golden Bell of Goa. It is he who is responsible for the foundation of the Vasco da Gama Institute in 1871, now rebaptized after the great Goan savant Menezes Braganza. A cursory glance through the many issues of its predicle will suffice to convince anyone that this institute, far from being a center of Portuguese culture, as some outsiders are made to believe, it is in fact an institute of Indian culture in the Portuguese language. It is Sakuntala in Portuguese skirts. In those issues, Goan scholars discoursed on themes essentially India. Suraiji Anand Rao, Tolentino Ferrao, a great Sanskrit scholar, Ismail Gracias, Cristau Pinto, and others are absolutely the persons who has used Indian themes expressing in Portuguese medium. And so we have Goan literatures writing in Portuguese on subjects that are essentially Bhartiya, Indian soil, and Englishmen. But we must have to accept one thing, that an Englishman, Edmund Gosse, advised Sarojini Naidu that time not to write in any longer of robins and skylarks, but to return and to turn to her own source of elements of India. None of them, such kind of advice, none of them tendered or given by the Portuguese to the Goan people. Sustaining the dominance of the Portuguese language for over 4 centuries, it is to the credit of Goans that Portuguese did not tear them off completely from their cultural moorings. There are Goan poets in Portuguese, there are Goan novelists in Portuguese, there are other writers in Portuguese in the different genres of literatures. The recurring theme is either Goa or India. This is deeply felt and more perfectly expressed by the poets. I would like to quote these sentences by Mr. Braganza, that this is deeply felt and more perfectly expressed by the poets endowed with a deeper sensibility and profound sense of awareness are never satisfied with artificialness. They think and feel on deeper planes of consciousness. That is why Goan poets' writings in Portuguese searched and researched the real essence of the Goan personality that was fundamentally Indian. Floriano Barreto wrote Night Moths and posthumous book. His most exquisite poem, full of lyrical sweetness, is The Dancing Girl of India. Though most of his poems favor local colors, Mariano Gracias was profoundly influenced by Buddhist philosophy. Land of Rajas is his outstanding contribution. His important poems are Prayer to Surya. Surya is Bhagwan's Suraj, sun. Alike wrote Lyre of Science, The Goddess of Bronzes, and others. Priti Das, the pen name adopted by this poet. A similar literary Indian nom de plume, Niti Pal, used by poet of extraordinary sensibility, Nascimento Mendoza, whose posthumous book, Vatsala, marks him as a dancing girl who, since she cannot entice a rishi, poisons him in order to at least find solace by jumping into his fire. In a few bold strokes, he gives us a poetic delineation of Apsaras, Sadhu, Purohit. He is the Dead is based on some elements of the great Indian epic, the Ramayana. Other praiseworthy books of his era are Hops of Hind, Lotus of Blood, and Ideal Temptation of Vatsala, and other important notable work. But all these are redolent of Indian pantheism. Apart from writing treatises on Hindu civilization, Adiodato Barreto, together with Telo Mascarenhas and José Paulo Teles, and others founded an Indian institute in Coimbra in 1928, from where the Goan intelligentsia edited a journal in Portuguese called New India. And for that, Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore sent his words, the land of India is sent his words, considering the literary work of some Goanism, Coimbra, Portugal, because he was considering as a replica of Santiniketan of Kolkata for the Goan intelligentsia, that I send my, and I quote Rabindranath Tagore, I send my greetings to Portugal in recognition of her old bond of relationship with India and in expectation of the opening of a channel of cultural communication with her for the furtherance of the cause of Vishwabharati Global India, which is to create an international mind. And they had translated the Gitanjali, the first paragraphs, onde o espírito vive sem medo e a frente se mantém erguida, onde o saber é livre, onde o mundo não foi dividido em pedaços por estreitas paredes domésticas. Dentro deste céu da liberdade, o meu Pai deixa que se erga a minha pátria. Where the mind is without fear, and I translate in English now, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Language has long served as a conduit for cultural transmission and exchange. In the Indian context, the Portuguese language occupies a unique position, deeply intertwined with historical, trade, colonial rule, and cultural interaction. Despite its diminishing role post-liberation, the language remains a symbol of Indo-Portuguese heritage and continues to hold relevance through academic programs, cultural initiatives, and linguistic pressures in Indian vernaculars. Whenever we want to write Indian history without Goan history, it can't be completed. Edward P. Lazare, in his journal Culture and Language, rightly mentioned that common culture and common language facilitate trade between individuals. Individuals have incentives to learn the other languages and cultures so that they have a larger pool of potential trading partners. The value of assimilation is larger to an individual from a smaller minority than to one from a larger minority group. When a society has a very large majority of individuals from one culture, individuals from minority groups will be assimilated more quickly. In post-liberalized India, we are trying to re-establish this channel by means of different institutions. Has steadily grown in importance, particularly in regions like Goa, where it retains historical and cultural significance since 1510, with the advent of Afonso de Albuquerque in 1510 in Goa, is often referred to as policy of marriages, políticas dos casamentos. He also promoted Portuguese language to the local population, particularly the mestizos, those of mixed Portuguese and local heritage, by fostering a group of bilingual or Portuguese-speaking locals loyal to the crown. Albuquerque aimed to consolidate Portuguese authority in Goa and the surrounding territories. Additionally, the influence of Portuguese-derived terms increasingly entering Indian popular uses calls for further investigation to understand their impact. I think this thing I would like to skip because Professor Hugo Cardozo already mentioned it. Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm about to conclude. So, but whenever we want to do this confluence between cultures, we need translator that's supposed to be honest and good, because Fernando Pessoa has told, like amina lingua e mina patria. A translator has two fathers. One is source language, one is target language, and they have to behave to remain faithful to these two fathers. Even though if they can be less fiddle to one language, they can lost something. Why this lost and found in translation, or sometimes lost in translation happen? We can interpret this as our own personal skill to interpret any piece of literature. There is a Portuguese proverb, cada mente, de cada interpretação, each mind their own narrative, and we should have, but as a translator, we have some sort of binding culture as well. We have different versions of translations of a single book. Sometimes one translator missed the essential and picked by another translator. Translation is a serious job, and it is advisable not to get fantasized or romanticized with the text, rather to understand the cultural load, what the text and the moreover the word carries, and careful localized and the target language so that a reader from the target languages has the same stimulation of emotion as the readers from the source languages have. If, as a translator, we cannot do our justice, we are the victim of the Italian saying which says, traduttore, traditore, translator is a traitor. The succinct saying highlights the inherent challenges of translations, how nuances, emotions, and cultural context can be altered or lost in the process of transferring meaning from one language to another. It emphasizes the difficulty of remaining completely faithful to the original text, while when a translator does not know the source language and target language and use secondary literature to translate, they most probably become the victim of Chinese whisper and hence lost in translation. Some limited, some sense it happened. Rightly, sir has mentioned. Yes, sir. Just few seconds. Each word has their own cultural inheritance, which comes in cultural pocket that must be tested with the palette of rightly acquired literary and linguistic competency before translating literary text. For example, Os Lusíadas, written and compiled in 1572, a Portuguese great epic with 8,869 verses, decasyllabic literary framework. This is very complex verses written in archaic Portuguese, translated Portuguese epics by Lusíadas into Indian language by Malayalam C.J. Davis with help of Professor Manuel Ferro. Likewise into Konkani by Olivinho Gomes in 1974. But there in Portuguese Academia, or who works in Indo-Portuguese field, receives C.J. Davis translation in Malayalam with very cold feet. Why? Because he does not know Portuguese. What I want to advocate here, that before translating any kind of serious literary text, we must understand and know the culture of the target language and source language. On this note, I would like to conclude by saying that, in addition, I think that the teaching of Portuguese and the translation of Lusophone literature in India serve as a vital bridges for cultural exchange to broaden the mutual horizon, to enhance mutual understanding on different paradigm and fronts. Connecting India with the broader Lusophone world, the integration of translation into languages education not only enhances linguistic proficiency but also fosters deeper cultural understanding. Through the translation of works such as Lusíadas, Gitanjali, Moheshtama, and revival of our literary works done in early 70s and 80s, the rich legacy of Indo-Portuguese literature is made accessible to Indian audiences and to Indian classical texts. So as India strengthens its ties with Lusophone countries, these emphasize on mutual interest. Like IPSA, BRICS, and PALOPS, it proposes a framework that integrates translation practices into language pedagogy, creating a holistic approach to meet the growing demand for trained professionals, while advancing India's engagement with Lusophone cultures. Such an approach not only strengthens educational outcomes, but also positions India as a key player in fostering cultural and literary ties across the global south and global north. Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Ajit Kumarji. It is perfectly right when you say, because the translation of a literature is translation of a culture. So we are stuck to this concept of confluence of cultures. Now we have almost all the panelists have given their views. All the panelists have spoken about literature from Goan literature, Goan literature into Portuguese or Portuguese literature into Konkani. Now our topic was myths and literature. So nobody seems to have touched upon the topic of myths, except briefly Sheila's topic was dealing with the myth that have. So myths are surrounding our cultures. I don't know the time left now, but according to me, if 5 minutes are left, then I'll speak on the myth part of it. Okay, I'll take to the podium so that nobody will stop me. So when the Portuguese came here in 1510, Goans started calling them Paklo. You know why Paklo? Anybody from Goa knows? Probably they don't. Because we simply call Paklo is white. But it is when the Portuguese landed, stepped on the Goan soil, all the soldiers were wearing caps with a feather. The feather in Konkani is Pak. So all the people coming with feathers were Pakle. So that is how Paklo became synonymous with the whites, and particularly the Portuguese. Anyway, we lived with this myth for a long time. But then there are many myths that have, generally when myths are born out of misconceptions, sometimes they blend with the reality also. But we in Goa particularly, we have so many myths, very, very interesting. And I always feel that literature has not taken advantage of these myths to write their writings. In the writings, you don't find them reflecting to that extent, to the extent which I expected. Anyway, let me touch upon some of the myths that surround this part, this culture. Well, we all have heard of Goans I need not tell about, but then probably those who are in attendance here, the members of this august audience probably have heard of Urak. Urak is a summertime beverage, very popular in Goa. So I'll just briefly tell you why it is known as Urak. Of course, it is known as Arak elsewhere in the southern parts of India. But then that also has, that word Arak has derived from Urak. But where did Urak derive from? So I'll just tell you shortly. It is said that the process, that cashew tree was brought in to Goa by the Portuguese. So it came to Goa, it was grown in Goa, it proliferated in Goa, and then it went to other parts of Goa, other parts of India also. But that is how the cashew apples and cashew nuts and the cashew trees grew in Goa. Then it is said that the process of distilling Urak was taught to us by one of the monks originally from Spain, from Leon, which is also part of Spain now. The monk who first distilled the brew wanted to baptize it. He brewed it, and he found it is something very nice and something unique. But what do I baptize it with? So he wanted a title or name for that brew. So that was the time when a daughter of Portuguese king was married to the king of Leon. The beautiful queen had the name Urak. And he found that by giving that name to this wonderful beverage, he is doing justice or paying his loyalty to both the king of Portugal and also the queen of Leon. That is how that name Uraka was given to this beverage. That is one of the myths which I came across. I love to share with you. But more importantly, there is yet another myth in Goa which is living even today. That is about, it is surrounding the goddess, Our Lady Milagris. Milagris Saibini we call in Goa. Our Lady Milagris has a church in Mapsa, very popular deity. It is believed that she is one of the 7 sisters, and the rest of the 6 sisters are from belonging to other parts of Bardez and surrounding areas. One is Lairai, the other is Murzai. People from Goa will probably identify with these names. Lairai, Murzai, Mabai, then Mahalsa. And then also Adadipa, which is not traced where she is gone. And then they have a brother called Khetoba. But one of the sisters is Milagrish. And there are a lot of folklore is based on that. You know, when we sing some songs in folk songs, there is a mention of this, and it goes both ways. We describe our lady. If we say Ratha Tujo Guriyo, Rathi Kone Baisilya Devi Ge, one says Rathi Baisilya Milagris Saibin Ge. And the other part, the Goan Hindus, they name their deity as Rathi Kone Baisilya, Rathi Baisilya, Se Laira Ige or Malsage. So these are the folk songs which are attributed to both the deities. It's a wonderful, you know, these myths have always, there are two types of myths. Some are myths which lead to positivity, and some lead to negativity. Some strengthen the beliefs of togetherness, and some try to, you know, give the negative, take the negative approach, particularly when it comes to two communities or two segments. So here, this particular myth, I like it because it reminds us of our past, reminds us of the fact that we were one people at one time. And today, when we are divided also, we can continue to keep up the relationship. And we believe, and it is a fact that at some point of time, every year, some offerings are sent from church to the temple, or from temple to the church. What a beautiful thing. So these are some myths I know about. I love to share with you. And of course, there are other myths. Many people believe that Goans were civilized by the Portugal, which is yet another myth. There are people who say our culture was, you know, rather, what do you call it, disturbed by the Portuguese. It is not true. Culture is like a flowing river. It cannot be disturbed by anything. So, so these are some myths which have lived with them, and over the years, I know some of the myths will disappear, some myths will strengthen further. I only hope that positivity is passed on through the myths and through our literature. I thank you very much for listening very patiently. And in spite of the fact that your lunch is delayed, you have courage to give me an applause. Thank you very much. And I thank the organizers for getting me here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I now call upon Professor Rosa Maria Parish to kindly hand over the mementos to our distinguished panelists, the chair and the panelists. To our moderator, Mr. Damodar Mauzo. To Ms. Sheila Jayavant. To Reverend Dr. Father Euphemian Miranda. To to Mr. Madhav Borkar. And last but not the least, Dr. Anil Kumar Yadav. Thank you. While I request the panelists to kindly assemble for, I request you to join us for lunch in the foyer. And I think we can be back by 2:30.